Smart. Hi, everyone. This is a huge crowd for me. I haven't figured out why this is, but when I present my work at philosophy conferences, they always put me in the smallest room in the last session of the last day, and I have like 5 people. So maybe I should switch disciplines. This is pretty cool. All right, so welcome to my tutorial on ethical theory for machine learning. I'm Nick Schuster. I'm a research fellow at the Australian National University. I'm a member there of the Humanizing Machine Intelligence Grand Challenge, as well as the Machine Intelligence and Normative Theory Lab led by Seth Lazar. Most of my research is funded now by the Templeton World Charity Foundation grant for research on moral skill and artificial intelligence. And of course, I created this tutorial for Fact 22. All right, so I'm going to start with this big question of what is ethics. And roughly the first half of the tutorial is going to cover ground that I think will be familiar to people who are fairly knowledgeable already about technology ethics. So if that's you, sorry, it's going to be about 15 minutes before it gets interesting. The second half, I'm going to venture into newer territory, and I'm going to be deliberately provocative. I'm going to argue for an approach to ethical machine learning that I'm not completely confident in by any means, and I'm hoping it's going to spark some interesting conversation. Okay, so I'll start with this question: what is ethics or moral philosophy? And I'm going to approach this question by responding to 4 kinds of skepticism about the nature and scope of ethics: libertarianism, utilitarianism, relativism, and technocentrism. If you have familiarity already with ethical theory, you might find it surprising that I've listed libertarianism and utilitarianism as forms of skepticism, but hang in there. I will explain why I'm doing that. Okay, and then after that, I'll talk about the relevance of ethics to machine learning for a bit and discuss the moral dimensions of data, algorithms, and applications of AI systems. A lot of sessions here have talked about this stuff, so that should be fairly familiar as well. And I'll consider 3 problems, or two broad approaches to ethical ML. First, we can make machines good, and by that I mean we can try to make machines conform to moral standards as they do the many morally significant things that they do, things like driving cars, surveilling public spaces, processing loan applications, predicting criminal behavior, recommending products and digital content, and many, many, many other things. Second, we can try to make machines make people good. And by that, I mean we can try to design and apply them so as to afford good ethical agency on the part of their users. I'll also note 3 problems facing any approach to ethical ML: moral risk, moral uncertainty, and moral disagreement. In brief, it can be hard to determine what counts as morally good or bad behavior in a given situation. For these reasons, and since it's difficult to get a machine to do something complex, even when we have a clear idea of what that is, it's going to be that much harder to get a machine to do something complex when we don't have a clear idea of what that is. Okay. And then for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to turn to the question of how ethical theory can best inform the design and application of systems built with ML under these conditions of moral risk, uncertainty, and disagreement. And I'll propose a framework for ethical ML that can marshal resources from philosophy, computer science, and the cognitive and social sciences. So let's start with this general question: what is ethics? This is something that ethicists disagree about, not surprisingly. But I do think there are some things that we can say that aren't too controversial. First, we can say ethics is the branch of philosophy concerned with the right and the good. That means that ethics is a normative field. In normative fields, they deal with questions not just about how things are, but how they should be. Questions like, what should we do? What should we aim to bring about? And what sort of people should we be? And it's important to note that questions like these can't be answered simply by looking at how people do act, or what they do try to bring about, or what sort of people they are. Now, that's not to say that empirical inquiry isn't helpful. In fact, empirical evidence can inform ethical inquiry in lots of important ways, but it can't ultimately settle questions like these. We need qualitative methods to answer those kinds of questions. So, for instance, examples in cognitive and social sciences might suggest that people tend to do bad things when they're instructed to do so by authority figures. So here are some, medieval guys torturing somebody. It also might suggest that we rely on sub-rational intuition instead of rational deliberation when making certain kinds of moral judgments. But it doesn't follow from this that we should defer or shouldn't defer to authorities in morally complicated situations, or that we should rely or shouldn't rely on certain cognitive processes rather than others when making important moral judgments. So we need qualitative methods, and it's natural, I think, to be skeptical about qualitative methods if you're not familiar with them. There are a number of reasons for this. I think one common reason is that the kind of data that qualitative methods rely on, it can be subjective, it can be idiosyncratic even. It can be the sort of thing that is sort of a moving target. Things like naturalistic observations, right? Interviews, questionnaires. And ethical theorists like me, we're like the worst because we rely on our own and others' moral intuitions as a sort of basic form of data. And that can be really subjective and really culturally specific and really idiosyncratic. It can be situation specific and it can be unstable over time. And these kinds of intuitions also tend not to be representable in a way that makes them easy to process on a large scale. But importantly, this doesn't mean that that kind of data defies systematic analysis altogether. So ethical theory has methods that serve this purpose, and I'm going to talk about a few of those methods. So first, we have thought experiments. And we can use these to establish and refine a set of pre-theoretic moral intuitions. And by pre-theoretic, I mean the sort of material we start from, right, before we've come to any kind of theoretic conclusions or any kinds of proposed ways of systematizing our intuitions. So a thought experiment works by tweaking certain variables while holding others constant to reveal how our intuitive responses vary along with them. My favorite example comes from Joel Feinberg. He famously has this case of examples of things people might do in front of you on a bus, and each one is more disturbing than the last. These things include stuff like eating their own and others' vomit, mutilating a human corpse, and performing oral sex on a dog. So these are things that wouldn't physically harm you in the strictest sense, but they are things you might have a legitimate claim against people doing in front of you in a public space. And because, they would be deeply upsetting. So by varying the details of the offensive behavior, Feinberg helps us to refine our understanding of what counts as something that's just annoying, like a person who smells bad sitting close to you. That's his first example. Versus things that are legitimately offensive, like somebody wearing a Nazi armband. So thought experiments can also challenge our moral principles and judgments and intuitions. James Rachels has a classic one here. So he presents this case of two scenarios which are identical in all except one important respect. In the first case, a person drowns his young nephew in order to inherit his fortune. In the other case, he is intending to drown his nephew and finds that his nephew has slipped and hit his head on the side of the tub and is now drowning, and he just lets him drown in order to inherit his fortune. If those seem equally bad to you, it's an interesting result because it means that this common judgment we might have made beforehand that killing a person is worse than just letting a person die, it calls into question the legitimacy or the universality of that judgment, and it raises questions about why we generally think that killing a person is better than just, or is worse than just letting a person die. So because he's held everything constant except for that one variable, we're going to have to look elsewhere for a systematic explanation of why we generally have this intuition otherwise. So ethical theory also has methods for systematically making sense of this sort of qualitative data that can be generated and refined by thought experiments. And there are different approaches here, but you can sort of broadly think of them as being either reductionist or coherentist. Reductionist methods, the goal is to reduce all moral intuitions and consider judgments to the smallest possible number of principles that can still adequately explain this whole data set. And this invariably ends up requiring a lot of data cleaning, or whatever you want to call the sort of equivalent of data cleaning in ethical theory, because it just turns out that it's really hard to systematize all the sort of ordinary moral intuitions and consider judgments that most of us have. All right, and so reductionist approaches tend also to end up being sort of revisionist, meaning that they end up concluding that a lot of the widely held moral intuitions and judgments that people have are just wrong. Now, if you're going to do that in ethical theory, you do owe an explanation for why people widely hold false moral judgments or intuitions. And so you have to sort of justify why you're revising common sense morality to the extent that you are. So according to, for instance, some versions of a popular theory called utilitarianism, which I'll mention again later, it's okay to kill one person in order to save 5 people. Now, supposing that one person is innocent and also adamantly protesting being killed in order to save 5 people, I take it that most people intuitively think that that would be wrong to do. So if utilitarianism is going to conclude that that's in fact okay, and really it sort of has to say that it's not only okay, that it's required. And really, it has to say that it's not just, it'd be required to kill one person in order to save 5. It would have to say that it would be required of you to kill one person in order to save just 2, right? Because the whole point of moral action in the utilitarian view is to maximize well-being, and presumably, all else being equal, 2 people will enjoy more well-being than just 1. So they have to explain why we have these widespread mistaken moral intuitions. And they do have ways of doing this. So I'm not saying that utilitarianism is false or that it's a bad theory. One popular explanation is that all things considered, it actually does tend to maximize well-being if we follow rules of thumb, like don't kill people, because almost always it's going to detract from overall well-being if we do kill people. And it's really hard for people to recognize the exceptions. So we're right that killing people is presumably wrong, and it's good that we have that intuition. But still, in rare cases, it would be the right thing to do to override that intuition and do the rational thing and kill one person to save multiple people. That's the kind of explanation you often get from people who are committed to a utilitarian ethic. And some people think that this is an adequate way to explain away these sorts of anti-utilitarian intuitions that many of us have. I'm not one of those people. I'm not fully convinced by that kind of argument. And so I and others like me tend to take on a non-reductionist approach to ethical theory. And there are other reasons to avoid reductionism in ethical theory as well. One is that it raises some nagging questions about the justification of the basic principles. So once you've sort of reduced all of your intuitions and judgments to a single principle or set of principle, you might wonder if that can be justified on its own. Is it self-evident that maximizing well-being is the right thing to do? For my part, I don't find that I have strong intuitions one way or another about that question. It seems to me a lot will depend on how we define well-being, what maximizing amounts to. And so the idea that a principle like that could be self-evident seems implausible. But if it's not self-evident, and it is supposed to justify all these other intuitions and judgments, then why should we accept it on its own terms? So if you share that sort of view, then you too might be attracted to a non-reductionist view. So here's another thing you might say about why maximizing well-being is a good moral principle. It explains a lot of intuitions. It coheres with a lot of judgments. It coheres with a lot of principles. So maybe it's not the basic principle, but it is helpful for explaining a lot of our moral intuitions. And so you might move toward a more coherentist view of ethics. And of course, if you're going to do that, there's no pressure to have just one principle or any particularly small number of principles. You still are going to want your principles to do explanatory work. So you're going to want some principles that are more basic than others. But on a coherentist view, the whole set of intuitions and judgments and moral principles are mutually supportive. A lot of people find that to be an attractive alternative approach to ethical theory. Okay, so this move can avoid the problems of reductionism. And I'm not going to take it for granted. I'm just going to suggest that these are different ways in which you can systematize this whole set of moral data that we have, intuitions, considered judgments, and presumptive principles. Now, either way, whichever approach you prefer, the measure of plausibility or the measure of a theory is that it arrives at its conclusions through valid arguments from plausible premises. All right, so it's not, the point of ethics isn't to sort of provide a proof on the analogy of mathematics for moral conclusions, but rather to present a coherent and systematic explanation that is sufficiently close to our kind of intuitive judgments about the right and the good. And I'd also note, we could talk about this more later if you'd like, that this is also essentially what makes any kind of theory plausible, regardless of the kind of data that it aims to explain. So even in fields like physics and math, arguably what they're doing is giving either a reductionist account of the field in terms of a few basic principles, or they're trying to explain all of the things that the field is supposed to explain in terms of a set of principles that somehow cohere with each other in an internally, logically consistent way. So ethics, I think, ultimately isn't like a sui generis field of inquiry. All right. Now, you still might be skeptical about ethical theory for lots of reasons. You know, there's no exhaustive list of ways in which you can be skeptical about ethics, but I've chosen these 4 based on the kind of day one feedback that I get from students that I teach. So I've taught ethics for a number of years now to university students, high school students, and continuing education students. And I find that usually at least one person in the classroom is a hardcore libertarian and wants to say people should just be allowed to do what they want with minimal restrictions. And that's I think, a plausible point of entry into ethics. But of course, you quickly get to this question of, well, what do you do when people's interests conflict, right? I also think libertarianism is an interesting one to discuss at this sort of conference because it's a disproportionately popular ethical outlook in the tech industry. And I'm not sure why exactly that is. I mean, I think there's a lot of sort of resistance to government regulation. I also think there's a kind of interest in empowering individual users. That's really admirable. But for whatever reason, it's a popular view. But yeah, it runs into these sorts of problems. So I mean, you can imagine, like, if I own a social media startup and you do too, and we both want ours to be the most popular, that's a conflict. But it's not one that really requires intervention. In fact, it doesn't even seem to require self-restraint, right? We can just sort of duke it out and see who wins. And there's nothing morally troubling about that. But if our pursuit of social media dominance ends up conflicting with our users' interests and things like privacy and autonomy and well-being, that raises some deep questions. Now, this isn't to say that libertarianism is an implausible theory. I think it's a very plausible theory, and sophisticated versions of it can explain how we can resolve these kinds of conflicts in ways that are ethically responsible. This is just to say that when you can't reduce ethics to a principle as simple as people should be allowed to do what they want with minimal restraint, right? You're going to have to say a lot more about what people owe to each other in order to have a comprehensive and plausible ethical theory. And one direction you might want to go with that, if you want to avoid the thorny territory of what we owe to each other, you might be attracted to utilitarianism. There's another one. I always have at least one student who on day one is like, we should just do what's best for everyone. And that's another plausible point of entry, into ethics, but you quickly get into trouble there as well. So what is best for everyone? Who's to say what's best for everyone? And like I said earlier, what if you want to say well-being, that's plausible, but what does well-being include? Does it include that my rights are respected, or just that I'm happy, that my life is full of pleasant experiences? What are those? And who's to say is a really troubling question, I think, for anyone attracted to utilitarianism, because we can have reasonable disagreements about this. And it's very hard to settle those disagreements about what sort of lives we should all be living, what's good for us. And now if you think that that's a problem, you might also be attracted to a sort of ethical relativism. And that's a more radical kind of moral skepticism. This one seems extremely popular among high school and college students. Well, what's interesting to me about it is it takes very little prodding, I think, to find out that young people who have this view that values shouldn't be imposed on others, they're just social constructs, they're just made up. They're usually really concerned about diversity and inclusivity, and they don't think that some values should be forced upon others or should dominate others. And that is such a strong ethical commitment. It's like one of the strongest ethical commitments I think you can have. And so it really is, I think, at its base, it's an ethical theory itself, at least the version that most people seem to espouse. But you run into problems there too. I mean, what about intolerant value systems? What about white supremacy? Should that not be imposed upon? If you look at the way that values work in societies, some values always come to dominate others. And it seems like we have some obligation to make sure that some values come to dominate rather than others. And I think, white supremacy is a particularly illustrative one because it tends to dominate other values in the societies where it gets a strong footing. So it doesn't seem to me that we can remain that agnostic about which values should dominate. We have to make some choices, and diversity, that's a plausible one. Inclusivity, that's a plausible one. Right? So once again, not that it's not really an implausible theory, it's just that it can't be so simple as no one's values should be imposed on others. We have to say a lot more. We have to make a lot more substantive ethical commitments in order to generate a plausible theory. And then finally, I'll discuss technocentrism. And this is one that seems to be appealing to like a lot of people who don't have any connection to any kind of technical expertise. It's just sort of a widespread view, I think, in modern cultures that, well, this looks like a moral problem. It looks tricky, but we can fix it. Like it can be reduced to a sort of simple technical problem. And sometimes this looks plausible, like world hunger is a problem. And some people are very optimistic about the prospects of artificial intelligence. Some people think that it will inevitably increase the efficiency of the production and distribution and the improvement of every social good, from food and shelter and clothing to entertainment and information and education, to the point where every human need will be satisfied and everybody will be able to thrive. And then most of the sort of moral problems that we have today, the major ones anyway, will just be things of the past. Now, even if we grant that extremely sunny view of the prospects of artificial intelligence, there's still this issue of what is the problem and what would count as a good solution. This can be very difficult. So there are simple cases like, solving malnutrition. That's kind of a no-brainer. But is it? I mean, what kind of food should we produce? Should we produce animal-based food or plant-based food? Should we take into consideration the effects of the food we produce on health and the environment? So that looks like an easy question, but it's one that's going to have to answer some more difficult ethical questions. And then there are even trickier problems like, what do you do about pornography? Some people think that as long as you've got consent, everybody's an adult, there shouldn't be any regulation beyond that. Other people have pointed out that pornography plausibly perpetuates sexism and sexual violence. And so there's disagreement there about whether there's a problem in the first place. And certainly we have to define whether there's a problem and what the problem is before we can figure out what a technical solution would look like. So this is all just to say that different forms of skepticism about ethics, they are often very plausible starting points for ethical theory, but they're not ending points for ethical theory. They quickly lead into questions that we have to answer if we're going to give a plausible and comprehensive account of moral life. Okay, so I think that the reason, especially when we're thinking about technology, that we get into these, we just very quickly get into these tricky ethical questions, is that technology is inherently practical. All right, so from the very beginnings of human ingenuity, things like arrowheads, all the way to things like microprocessors, we're always developing technologies to serve our ends. And because our practical ends and the ways in which we pursue them are morally evaluable, so are the technologies we use. We have to ask questions like, should we be doing this in the first place? And if so, should we be doing it in this particular way? So I think this applies to primitive as well as modern technologies. But to give an appropriate example for this conference, we can consider the well-worn territory of facial recognition technology. So this is an algorithmically driven technology. It raises important questions like who should use it? Should the state use it? Should private organizations use it? Should just individuals use it? On whom should they use it? Citizens, employees, should we only be allowed to use it on ourselves? There are questions about what the legitimate purposes of this technology are, espionage, security. Should it be just a convenience technology for people? And all of those answers we might offer those questions should inform the question of how those technologies ought to work. Okay. So quickly, I'll just go over these again. You're probably familiar with this, but there are thoroughly analyzed moral dimensions to the various aspects of machine learning. Data, for instance, can be collected and curated in unethical ways. Common example is the lack of diversity in images for facial recognition programs tends to lead to differential performance for people of different races and genders. That's obviously a problem. It's one that's gotten better over time, so it's notable that a technical fix has sort of alleviated some of the moral problems with this technology, but we still have these important questions about how should it be used, who should use it, on whom, et cetera. Algorithms can be morally problematic by, for instance, finding patterns in data in unethical ways. For instance, predicting rearrest or loan default based on a person's zip code. This is problematic because zip codes are often a proxy for things like race. Race is generally considered to be an inadmissible piece of evidence for making these kinds of predictions. And it's just more generally, zip codes tend to correlate with access to social goods. So if you are using zip codes to disadvantage people, that amounts to disadvantaging people on the grounds that they are already disadvantaged. So obviously morally problematic. And finally, applications of ML-driven systems can be unethical, even when the data sets and algorithmic inferences that they use are on their own okay. One example of this is using recommender systems to encourage excessive use. So you might not have any problems with the data that you've collected and curated or the algorithmic processes that you're using to make the inferences about what people are likely to click on. But if you're using it to sort of provoke this addictive behavior, right, that seems morally problematic, even though much of the development process is not on its own morally problematic. So we might take two different approaches, broadly speaking, and these are meant to be exclusive and they're not meant to be exhaustive. So I think that you can use both of these processes and others besides them, but I think these are the ones that seem to me to be most worth discussing. So first, we can make machines good. We can make them conform to moral constraints, or we can try to make them do so. And this, people have proposed all kinds of interesting things here, encoding moral constraints on behavior, sort of over and above the learning process. Or you can use moral principles as hyperparameters for learning. So you're trying to teach the system to sort of recognize what's an instance of a certain kind of moral activity or moral demand. You might have a system trained on moral data sets. So you might, like, for instance, code good ethical conduct in a certain situation versus bad, and see if you can train a system to distinguish between the two. Those are all really interesting possibilities. Another approach is to make machines make their users good. And different ways you might do this is to constrain the use of the product so that it's impossible to use it in unethical ways. You could also try to get a system to nudge users toward ethical behavior. Or another proposal I've heard recently that seems interesting to me is privileging users' higher order preferences. So this would be a sort of approach, as I understand it, where you would try to distinguish between a person's sort of superficial preferences and the preferences that sort of guide which preferences they want to have. If you could do that, that might be an interesting way into ethical ML, because our higher order preferences often track our deeper values in ways that our more superficial behaviors don't. So those are all really interesting possibilities. But any of these possibilities is going to run into these three problems. So there's moral risk, moral uncertainty, and moral disagreement. The idea here basically with moral risk is that even our well-intentioned choices sometimes go horribly wrong. So thanks to the sitcom The Good Place, people are now widely familiar with the trolley problem. So the idea is there's a runaway trolley. It's headed for one person or 5 people on the tracks ahead. It can be diverted onto another track and hit just one person. Is it okay? Is it required? What should you do? So the person who actually first called this the trolley problem was Judith Jarvis Thompson. And her analysis is super interesting. So she pointed out that the reasons that the people are on the tracks in the first place can make a moral difference. So she says, consider the one person on the side track is a contractor who's been hired to work on the tracks that day and has been assured that no trolleys are running. So he's perfectly safe. The 5 people on the other track are thrill seekers who have hopped a fence covered in warning signs and are there to tempt fate. That seems to make a moral difference to what you choose to do here. But if the conductor doesn't know this, that introduces moral risk into the situation in an interesting way. It looks like they could do something with a good intention and yet end up doing something seriously harmful and arguably seriously wrong. Then there's moral uncertainty. This is just the idea that we can be uncertain about the moral status of the choices available to us. I don't know whether it's okay to kill one person in order to save 5. It's a difficult issue. And it's an issue about which people can reasonably disagree. And so we have this third problem of moral disagreement. I think moral disagreement is extremely widespread. It seems like reasonable disagreement is possible for almost any moral problem, at least to some extent. And when we have those kinds of problems, we have to ask, who's right? And how could we know? And what happens if we get it wrong? All right, so returning to these 2 broad approaches to ethical theory, it's interesting to consider how ethical theory might be used constructively as a tool for ethical ML and not just a tool for technosocial critique. I think that ethical theory has established itself pretty well at this point as a good tool for technosocial critique. Ethicists are really good at raising problems that people don't have easy answers to. Right? But now we should say something constructive about how we might help to make systems more ethical. So how might these systems be designed and implemented in ways that help us to deal with these problems of moral risk, moral uncertainty, and moral disagreement? So this is now the part of the talk where I'm going to say provocative stuff that a lot of people are going to disagree with. So first, I think it might look like making machines conform to moral standards is a good approach for more autonomous systems, right? If they're not supervised, we want them to have kind of internal constraints, or sort of we want them to be reliably acting within moral constraints when they're unsupervised. Whereas this other approach of making machines afford ethical human behavior, that looks more appropriate for non-autonomous or less autonomous systems, things that are more like tools that we're just using in our daily lives. So that's a sort of intuitive thought there. But this is just an issue that I can't get past. And I don't know if this is just my problem, but I don't know how to characterize the difference between an autonomous and a non-autonomous artificial intelligence system. Partly because the kinds of examples of autonomous systems, like autonomous weapon systems, or even just like unsupervised systems that process and reject loan applications and things like that, they're clearly subject to some kind of human oversight at some level, right? An autonomous weapon system, for instance, can't go AWOL and join the Peace Corps, right? It's just that's built into its design. And so there are important respects in which even the most autonomous systems are just very distant from the kinds of agents that we are. And then non-autonomous systems do so much without our supervision, right? Our news feeds, that seems like a non-autonomous system, but it constrains what you can do by giving you a sort of set list of options. Its design also encourages certain behavior, like if it's an endless scrolling sort of news feed, you know, it's doing a lot of things for you and to you without your direct supervision. And so in many important respects is non-autonomous. So it seems to me that the best way to characterize just about any extant machine learning driven system is that it's autonomous in some respects and non-autonomous in others, and that those two things are going to be complexly intertwined. So let's suppose then, for the sake of argument, that it would be best if we consider ML systems to be primarily tools for our use and not agents in themselves. If that's the approach we take, then the question of how to make people good is the primary ethical concern. And the question about how to make machines good is sort of a secondary ethical concern. Not that it's unimportant, it's just that it comes after that initial question of how do we make users good through the design and implementation of the system. To illustrate this, let's consider another really popular example, prediction in criminal justice. So predictive systems have been used by police departments to determine where to allocate patrols, where crimes are likely to be committed. They've been used by judges to determine who's likely to be rearrested. So these are impactful decisions on people's lives. And that's algorithmic fairness is an extremely important area of ethical ML research. But I think that it tends to crowd out this more fundamental question about how people should use predictive systems in the first place. So consider the use of predictive systems for allocating social goods versus the use of predictive systems to allocate punishments, which is essentially what's happening in the criminal justice system. One of the major problems with the use in the criminal justice system is that race or proxies for race seem to always find their way into the predictions. And like we discussed earlier, that's just a huge ethical problem. But if you're using a predictive system to allocate social goods, arguably race is not only an acceptable consideration, it might be a required consideration because race does determine social outcomes in important ways, and it would be a sort of problematic colorblindness if we were to completely ignore race in our predictions of who has the strongest claim on scarce social resources. So this is meant to illustrate how a system that you wouldn't have to really change it at all, right? If you have a predictive system that says violent crimes are likely to be committed in this neighborhood, that's important information to have for the allocation of social goods, right? We can and should intervene in that situation before crimes occur, or someone is likely to be rearrested. There are other things we can do besides lock that person in jail. And if we use the very same systems to help us to determine how to make those interventions, suddenly things like race are no longer necessarily a problematic factor in those predictions. So I'm going to conclude here because I want to preserve some time for Q&A. So determining what ought to be done, all things considered, seems to me that it's just not plausibly a computational problem. I think that it can be in narrow contexts, but moral life is very complex. And I think there exists a wide space of actions that are permissible, but not required. And so moral life just isn't the kind of determinate practical domain that other practical domains are. And so this, a certain kind of intervention just doesn't seem to me plausible in moral life generally. But algorithmic tools can aid moral decision-making, but they don't answer these normative questions by themselves, especially under these conditions of moral risk, moral uncertainty, and moral disagreement. So we can get a handle on risk, but we can't determine whether a risk is worth taking with the help of an ML system. We can use them to make recommendations that may be useful when we're uncertain, but whether we should do what we would normally do or what a system predicts we will likely choose to do isn't necessarily helpful. And we can model moral disagreement in interesting ways, the way that some of the interesting work that's been done on mapping Twitter discourse, is an interesting way of sort of modeling moral disagreements. And that can help us to think about how to negotiate moral disagreement, but it can't solve that problem on its own, right? We have to make normative judgments here. So I'm going to just briefly talk in closing about this moral skill paradigm that I'm currently focusing on in my research. So thinking about good moral agency in terms of skills is really helpful because skill as a general matter, it enables people to cope with risk, uncertainty, and disagreement about what to do in all kinds of practical domains. So think about, for instance, cooking. It's a skill many of us have. I don't, but many people do. And there are risks and uncertainties and disagreements about the best way to do things in the kitchen. But a skilled cook is able to negotiate those successfully. That's sort of what separates a good cook from a bad cook, is just this complex capacity to negotiate risk, uncertainty, and disagreement. Lots of other skills, getting from one place to another safely on a bicycle. There's no single right way to do it, but some people are good at it, others are not. The people who are good at it are better at negotiating risk, uncertainty, and disagreement. So we can think about moral agency in terms of moral skills. And we can think about ML technologies as tools that can enable good moral agency the same way that good cookware enables good cookery. So here's what that framework might look like. So moral skills involve certain basic cognitive capacities. And this is the same with any kind of practical skill. Attention and memory and reasoning, rule taking and self-control, these manifest in different ways in all kinds of different skill domains, and I think including the moral domain. And moral skills use these capacities in the service of specifically moral values. Arguably, I think this is just what makes a problem a moral problem, as opposed to some other kind of problem. So there are certain motivations in cooking that make a problem a cooking problem. How do you make a meal that's delicious and nutritious and affordable? How do you make a decision that's kind and fair? And finally, ML-driven technologies can affect these capacities in complex ways. So we should ask, what are the distinctive affordances of the given tool? Which capacities are they apt to affect and how? How do these capacities function in morally skilled agency? And how might this technology change things? And finally, how could the choices we make about data and algorithms and applications of this system make it a useful tool for coping with risk, uncertainty, and disagreement in moral life? And I just want to point out again that these are parallel questions that you can ask for other familiar skill domains. So again, think about cooking. What are the distinctive affordances of a cast iron skillet? How is it likely to affect the skills of the cook? I mean, it conducts heat a little differently than other kinds of materials, right? And that's going to have an influence. And so if you're trying to design a good cast iron skillet, you have to take into account things like, well, people's hands can't handle a certain amount of heat, right? They're very heavy, and so they can limit what people can do in those respects. But they also have certain advantages. You can ask similar questions then about the design of ML tools that you do to I think really any kind of tool. And here's a way of illustrating how this might apply to a particular kind of ML-driven technology. So recommender systems, these are ubiquitous tools now. They direct they allocate our attention with often little to no direct cognitive engagement. And that's an interesting feature of these tools, right? And of course, they're apt to affect our attentional skills. Right? When we attend to the things that we attend to in moral life, right? We pay attention to our friends when they're in distress. We pay attention to instances of bigotry in our communities. These are things that make us good moral agents. And what's interesting about the way we allocate attention in those kinds of cases is that it's deeply connected with our values, right? If I care about social justice, I'm much more likely to notice and attend to instances of bigotry than if I don't care about social justice. Similarly, if I really care about this friend more than other people in my lives, I'm more likely to attend to that person's needs and that person's troubles than I am to other people. And so one of the things we might worry about with recommender systems is because they don't have the same kind of cognitive engagement that sort of form our attentional habits apart from these systems. They may weaken that connection between our values and what we attend to. And this has implications for the data and algorithms and applications of these systems. So we should ask questions about maybe how should we model users' deeper values rather than just sort of shallowly modeling their preferences in an effort to predict which content they're likely to engage with. And if we want these tools to make us better moral agents and not worse moral agents, maybe we should consider how they can support this kind of value-informed allocation of attention. How might they generate recommendations that users can endorse, right? We don't just want quantity of engagement. I mean, that maybe is what the economic incentive is, but if we're being sensitive to ethical concerns, we also want quality of engagement. We want people to be able to reflectively endorse the kinds of things that they pay attention to when they use these systems. So how might they encourage this kind of active engagement instead of just passive reflection? Or passive reliance, rather. Okay, so returning once more to these problems of moral risk, uncertainty, and disagreement. Like I said earlier, I think often there's no single right thing to do in moral life. That seems very, very straightforward. So good moral agency is often just about making prudent and reasonable choices rather than making the right choice or the best choice. And having good values and the cognitive capacities necessary to act in the service of those values will constrain what we'll do, but it won't necessarily fully determine what a person will do, right? It'll narrow the field of possibilities, but it still tends to leave open a lot of options. And as with other skills, moral agents might enhance their moral skills in particular by making good use of automated systems that can help them to negotiate, but again, not eliminate the risk, uncertainty, and disagreement endemic to moral life. So the thought here is that when we have a sort of a field of possibilities, and many of them would be impermissible, but some would be permissible, and among them, there's no necessarily right ordering of best to worst. Tools will help us, these sorts of tools can be designed, I think, to help us sort out that field of possibilities, to narrow the field in front of us and to help us to negotiate that, much the same way that, again, there's no right way to cook an egg, right? There are lots of wrong ways to cook an egg. I know that much about cooking. I can make a crappy egg if I want to, but there are a narrow set of possibilities for cooking a good egg, and a good cast iron skill, it seems to me like it should help a good cook to do that. So I think that designing and applying ML-driven systems should be the primary task for ethical theory, and these considerations about how they should behave when they're not under direct human supervision are still important, but I think are better approached by first addressing the primary question of what kind of agents we want to be, what kind of lives we want to live, and how these tools can help us. So thank you. Go right ahead.
Thank you. So I think that towards the end, you were kind of going there, but I didn't really explicitly say it, so I'm just going to ask you. I don't know if you've ever read Ethics of Ambiguity by Simone de Beauvoir, or if you're familiar with Wise theory. So it's about the concept of freedom. So there's no false dichotomy, like, oh, if everyone has freedom, are the white supremacists going to take freedom for someone else? Because the point about freedom is about respecting everyone's freedom. And so, there's just no problem there. What you do need for that, though, is empathy. It's about caring and understanding. I think you put that in moral values. I would put empathy and moral skills. The vibe of this whole conference has been, how do we protect minorities and groups at risk? And I'm wondering if instead of listening to white men in power ethical philosophy, we should be looking at philosophy of women and minority groups. And they've actually fully answered all of the problems ages ago, but no one talks about them. So instead of a robot, a woman engineer, and all the other minorities. Another point about the trolley problem, which I always find super interesting, who sets a problem where someone gets to decide who lives and who dies? It's about power and control. So it's completely about, the dominant group. And I think, then this is going to sound maybe a bit insulting to some, but I think Agamben said the reason that men are so obsessed with power and control is because they want to control life, because they can't actually create it. So I'm going to end with that.
So first, I love Simone de Beauvoir. The Second Sex was one of my favorite things that I read in graduate school. I haven't read the book that you mentioned, but I'm not a full-on existentialist like de Beauvoir, but I do think that what you said about empathy is absolutely right. So I said role-taking as listed that as an important moral skill. And self-control, yeah. So the only reason I want to distinguish between role-taking and empathy is I think that empathy is kind of a thicker ethical notion. It has both the sense of being able to see or experience things from another person's perspective and to care about that person for their own sake, right? So I think that it's a mix of value and cognitive capacity. So this then I'm losing track of all the threads here. But so okay, the point about emphasis on the perspectives, let's say, of marginalized people generally, right, as being an important part of this. So absolutely right. I think that one of the reasons I'm attracted to thinking about moral agency in terms of skills and to thinking about AI ethics in terms of tools for good moral agency is that there's so much legitimate and I think worthwhile focus on the kind of institutional problems with who controls, like you said, who has the power here, and how is that power being used to shape these technologies and the way that they're used. I think that's all very important. I also feel like I think a lot of people probably share this, that it's a sad view, right? Because I don't feel like there's that much I can do about the institutional problems. I should do what I can, but I like the idea of thinking about technologies as tools that can make us individually better moral agents, because it feels empowering, right? It feels like if I have some control over the systems that I use, if it's through middleware or some other kind of intervention that just gives me more say in the way that these tools work and help me to pursue my ends. I think that I can pursue my values then in a way that doesn't necessarily depend on getting all those people with all the power to make the efforts that they ultimately need to make. So I think this is let's say a partial but woefully incomplete solution to those kinds of problems.
Thanks for a great talk. That was really interesting. As someone that has no philosophy training and learned a lot. You mentioned 3 problems for ethical ML, and moral uncertainty is the one I want to ask about. I think you defined it as we can be uncertain about the moral status of the choices available to us. I might be misunderstanding, but isn't that the whole point of ethics, as a field, is supposed to resolve that problem? And so how is it still a problem for ethical ML?
Good. So I think that one approach to ethical theory would be to try to solve the problem of moral uncertainty. That seems like an implausible conception of what moral life is about to me. So like I said, I don't think it's plausible to think that in any, or at least in most situations, that there is a right thing to do. Often, I think there is a set of possibilities that are all morally acceptable. I also am a believer in moral tragedies. So I think there are situations, these might be quite common, in which the only way you can do the right thing or a right thing is by doing something that's wrong in some other respect. So I think that the point of ethical theory is to give a systematic explanation of these kinds of problems. But it doesn't seem to me that the problem of moral uncertainty is one that can be solved. And that's just because of the way that I think about the basic nature of moral life.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk. You had on one of the earlier slides, you were talking about making machines good and then training system on moral data sets.
Sure.
And I noticed that sometimes people who are not in the fact community, they think that's what we do when we talk about algorithmic physics. They somehow think that we have these machines and then the machines learn to figure out what is moral, like kind of for us, almost in a like normative way. And I always think that's such a crazy, scary idea, but it's also no, it was a little bit, I don't think that's what you think we should do, but it was a little bit kind of potential. So I just wanted to ask you to like dream up maybe some more scenarios about that. Like what would be, I think I have an idea what would be bad about it, but maybe what would be the potential? Like what could be scenarios?
Sure, yeah. No, good question. So, so I'm not a computer scientist. I'm not an expert in the technical aspects of machine learning. So I get this from the people I know who are, and I talk to them about their projects in ethical ML. So the sort of thing I have in mind there is this idea that this is an attractive idea. So maybe we can't come up with universal moral principles. Okay, we definitely can't come up with universal moral principles. I'll just say that. But we do have moral exemplars, right? We have people we admire, and we have people we, at least in certain respects, nobody's perfect, but there are people we think are, like, I think my mom is a very kind person. She's not always a very fair person. She's not always a very wise person, but she's always a very kind person. And so you might think that, my mom is a good example for what to do in situations requiring kindness. And you might be able to, in one way or another, use the decisions of people as a sort of data set. And I guess you can imagine this in different ways, right? You say, how do the people we take to be kind people resolve these tricky situations? Are there patterns we can tease out of that? And can we learn anything sort of general about kindness by looking at the way that people we take to be kind generally behave in difficult situations? But there's another way in which this sort of already happens organically. So the stuff I had about recommender systems, that's inspired by a paper that I'm a co-author on. And one of the pieces of really helpful feedback that we've got recently is one of my friends at ANU pointed out that sometimes recommender systems can sort of nudge us in the direction of attending to the things we should be attending to, just because most people are decent enough to pay attention to them, right? And so, like, most people are decent enough to pay some attention, to what's going on with, like, the Black Lives Matter movement. And so, if I'm just like not attending to this at all, the very fact that many people are paying attention to it is going to play some function in getting me to look in that direction too. So that might be a sort of organic way in which good, or at least decent, moral agency is kind of providing data for a system that's then directing attention in ways that are at least better than the alternative. Not terribly imaginative, but.
So, first of all, thank you for your talk, especially the second part was very interesting. I would like to press you a little further on the idea of making machines make humans good. And I was wondering how you would, or I was wondering about your stance on moral responsibility in that case. So if you have a recommender system, as you said, for example, that is supposed to help human agents make more moral decisions or morally better decisions, so to say, where would you then place moral responsibility? Would that machine, that recommender system, then be morally responsible for the moral behavior of the human agent, of the human user? Or is the moral responsibility of the actions still with the human agent, like where would you place the moral responsibility?
Great question. So I think that a fruitful way into this is to think about the affordances of the technology. So there's a parallel question here. It's always helpful for me to think about sort of non-ML technologies, right? Simpler technologies and analogous questions. So we have this old adage that guns don't kill people, people kill people. It's not the gun's fault, it's the person's fault. But obviously the design and implementation of guns does create a certain incentive structure around them, right? And so like one of the most asinine things that you hear is like, well, if people didn't have guns, they just use hammers, right? No, nobody's like, oh, a hammer is a great tool for killing a person. Yes, it can be used, but it's not the sort of thing that like facilitates the killing of people in the way that a handgun does. And so I think you can look at it the same way, that like in the same way that people who design and sell weapons have certain responsibilities about the design and implementation of those weapons. I think that it's going to be a parallel analysis in the case of these technologies. But I also, one of the reasons that I think that it would be helpful to come up with more ways for people to have a more reflective and deliberative say in the way that the tools they use work is that it does sort of put more of the responsibility on them in the right way, right? So if I have some kind of way, and this is something that came up in a couple of talks that I've been to just today, to have an active role in the way that these systems work for me, that a recommendation system, for instance, works for me, then I can exercise greater responsibility over the way that this tool helps me to pursue my ends. And I think that'd be a good thing given my sort of individualistic emphasis in moral life here.
Another question. I mean, it's a bit. So thank you for the presentation and thank you for the last answer, which was really interesting. It's a bit coming back to the previous question, because I think your idea of moral skills is very interesting, and it makes me think about. I mean, if I want to draw a parallel with political philosophy, with this concept of capacity from Aristotle, replacing needs by capacity. But then I'm a bit afraid that, it's echoing the other question, that then you run into the same kind of difficulties when this was implemented by the United Nations. Because I mean, it's a bit the problem with machine learning algorithm. It's one company in Silicon Valley, but then it's scaled worldwide. So
Right.
It's going to be complicated to decide which moral skills you decide to develop, and
Yes.
you have a risk of patronizing them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, this gets into really deep issues, and I'm sort of drawing resources from cognitive psychology there, right? These are on the sort of list of basic cognitive capacities. And of course, they're supposed to be culturally neutral, but of course, they're not really culturally neutral, as you're pointing out. The alternative that I see to this way of thinking about moral agency, though, at least the only one I'm aware that's been well developed for the purpose of analyzing problems with technology, is a sort of reliance on classical conception of the moral virtues of things like courage and beneficence and temperance and self-control. And I see that as much more problematic for the sort of reasons that you're bringing up here, that those are thick ethical concepts that developed in very specific cultural contexts. And I just see, for one thing, courage on the ancient Greek battlefield does not look to me like courage on Twitter. It looks like a very different set of capacities and values at work there. So I don't think it's going to be that informative. And as you point out, what ancient Greek men thought courage looked like is probably not the best sort of universal value for us to strive for. So I'll grant you that, yeah, absolutely, the cognitive capacities and values that I think that are a better alternative are not a perfect alternative. But I think that they do get a good distance away from that kind of parochial ancient view of what the moral virtues look like. I think they draw on multiple fields, which I think is a good thing because these are problems to different extents in different fields. And I think that in the spirit of the way that I've tried to portray moral life as I understand it. I'll say that the goal shouldn't be to have universal values inform the way that we think about these things. The goal should be for us to be prudent and reasonable in the way that we interact with each other, and we should be inclusive of different voices in terms of how we think this stuff should go. So I think a big emphasis on intercultural dialogue is appropriate here, and inclusiveness of voices. It should not be seen as a project that should be once and for all finalized, right? But one that should be ongoing. Yeah.
First, I want to say thanks very much for this talk. And I think so. As preface in your discussion about how the tools which we are designing can ultimately have some effect on us in the ways that we might have our capabilities to reason as moral agents, like either heightened or constrained by the tools we're making use of. I actually feel in that I hear some echoes of like object-oriented ontologies in your discussion of like our machine learning models that are in deployment truly autonomous or non-autonomous. The gray area there, I feel like I hear a little bit of like Whiteheadian process philosophy. Both of these, I think, are somewhat provocative in the way that they express the skepticism of the existence of like an independent Enlightenment subject as a moral reasoner. And so I'm wondering if in your mind, do you think that this work of yours like rests on an assumption of a subject-object dichotomy? And if it does, how would you resolve this tension, it seems, that I feel that we are co-implicated by the tools we're making use of in the ways that we express ourselves as moral reasoners?
Yeah, really cool question. So I had not thought about this much, but I am inclined to resist any kind of hard dichotomy between subjects and objects here. If you're referring to like ourselves and the tools that we use, right? Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, part of my point here is, we have this interesting notion from skills that with somebody who is highly skilled, they talk about how like the bicycle is an extension of his body, right? And I think that's a cool way of thinking about it. And I do think that we would do well to think about these kinds of technologies in that same way. And that, I think, just underscores the importance of giving users as much power as possible over the way that these things function, right? Because one way or the other, they do sort of function that way. And recommender systems is one of my favorite examples because we hardly notice them, right? You open your news feed, it's there, right? You did nothing, it's just there, and we sort of just take it for granted. That's one of the most sort of troubling and problematic things about it. So I think that since we're going to operate that way anyway, we better do whatever we can to help people do that in a way that does express their agency rather than undermining it. Right. Thanks so much.